I always knew my family was complicated, but I wasn't prepared to lose everything in one moment. Not the house, not my dignity, and definitely not my father's legacy. As I sat in that sterile lawyer's office, the clock ticking loudly against the quiet tension, my brother Evan leaned back in his chair with a smug grin. "Dad knew who deserved it," he said, looking at me like I was a stranger who'd wandered into the wrong room. My mother, sitting right beside him, didn't even flinch. She just nodded and, in the coldest voice I'd ever heard from her, said, "You were always the disappointment, Claire." It felt like a punch straight to the chest. But then, in the middle of that painful silence, my 8-year-old daughter, Paige, stood up, opened her backpack, and looked around the room with more courage than I'd ever felt in my life. "Grandpa gave me something before he died," she said, her voice trembling but determined. "He made me promise to show it only if Uncle lied. Should I?" And just like that, everything changed. Let me back up for a second, because stories like this don't begin in a lawyer's office. They begin in the shadows of family expectations, in the invisible lines drawn between the favored and the forgotten. My name is Claire Dawson, and for as long as I can remember, I was the one who didn't quite measure up. Not because I wasn't smart or hardworking, but because I wasn't the child my parents had imagined. That title belonged to Evan, my older brother. Evan, at 42, was the golden boy, the successful stockbroker who drove a slate gray Tesla and wore designer watches that cost more than my monthly rent. He was everything my parents wanted: confident, polished, wealthy. And while he partied in Manhattan penthouses and posted pictures on Instagram of his beachfront vacations, I was here, raising my daughter alone, hopping between part-time teaching jobs, and spending my evenings caring for our father as cancer slowly took him away. But even in those final months, I never heard my father say the words I always longed for: "I'm proud of you, Claire." Losing Dad was its own kind of heartbreak. The funeral was quiet, reserved, like everything in our family always was. There were no speeches, just murmurs of condolences, and a closed casket. No one lingered around long enough to say real goodbyes. I thought maybe, just maybe, something would change after he passed. Not because I wanted money or recognition, just a sign that my sacrifices meant something. That's why Paige was with me the day of the will reading. My sweet, gentle Paige, with her wide hazel eyes and messy braid, sat next to me, clutching her little blue backpack like a shield. She didn't know the whole story, but children sense more than we think. She knew I was nervous. I told her we were going somewhere important, somewhere that would help us start over. When Mr. Hayes, the family lawyer, began reading the will, the sound of the air conditioner buzzed against the rest of the silent room. Evan shifted in his seat, feigning seriousness. My mother looked like she was already mourning her son's inconvenience at having to be here at all. And me? I was holding my breath, still believing there would be a moment of redemption. But that moment didn't come. The will was short and brutal. Evan inherited the house, the business, the savings, every large asset my father had worked for his whole life. I was left with a broken pocket watch, something Mr. Hayes described as sentimental value. Evan burst into a quiet laugh, pretending to stifle it with a cough. I felt the room pull away from me, like I was watching everything from underwater. Then came that line, like a dagger. Dad knew who deserved it. He said it like it was a joke, but it landed like the truth. My mother didn't even look at me when she confirmed it. "You were always the disappointment." Those words may as well have been written into the will, but at that exact moment when my hope shattered, it was Paige, my little girl, who pieced something together. She stood up. The room's energy shifted. She took something out from her backpack, a manila envelope with my father's handwriting scrawled across the front. She looked right at me and whispered, "Grandpa said this was for you, but only if Uncle lied." Everything, every smug word, every ignored sacrifice, suddenly felt like part of a story that wasn't over yet. And for the first time in years, I felt something surprising. I felt hope. And in that moment, the room fell completely, almost painfully still. It was about to be Evan's turn to listen. Before I found myself sitting in that suffocating lawyer's office, staring at two people who barely recognized me as their own, My life had already been a storm I was desperately trying to calm. I didn't walk into that room just as a daughter or a sister. I walked in as a mother, a caretaker, and a woman who had carried a lifetime of emotional baggage on her shoulders. My name is Claire Dawson, 38 years old, a single mother, and, for the better part of the past year, a full-time caregiver to my dying father. Before that, I was a middle school English teacher, the kind of job that doesn't make you rich, but, if you love it, fills parts of you that money never will. But life has a way of sending people down paths they never planned for. When my marriage fell apart 3 years ago, I was left with a shattered heart, a young daughter to raise, and a mountain of questions I didn't have answers to. So I packed up what little I had and moved us back to my childhood hometown in upstate New York. I thought it would give me some stability. I didn't know then that it would also bring me face to face with every unresolved wound I had tried so hard to forget. Our house back then was small, but it had a soul. I filled it with sticky notes of reminders, school projects, and hand-drawn stick. Figure families taped to the walls by my daughter, Paige, the one bright constant in my life. She was my world, all sharp wit and soft heart. And even at 8, she could sense every shift in my emotions, every quiet sigh I tried to hide, every night I stayed awake wondering how I'd make it through another day. Then came the call from my mother, not a, "How are you okay?" kind of call, just a cold, matter-of-fact statement. "Your father is sick, cancer. You should come home if you want to see him." It wasn't an invitation, it was an expectation. I knew what it meant. Dad wasn't just sick. He was dying. And yet the voice on the other end of the line had no tremor, no softness. That was Marianne Dawson, my mother, a woman who always valued reputation over connection. She loved order, silence, and control. She wasn't cruel, but she was distant. She never showed affection, not with words, and certainly not with touch. Her love was quiet, conditional, and defined entirely by what you could give, not who you were. Then there was Evan, her pride and joy. At 42, with his expensive suits and even more expensive smile, he was everything my mother ever wanted in a child. He was the captain of every sports team, the star of every family story, the one who made it. He never came back home, not even when Dad got sick. He said he was too busy with work, but we all knew the truth. Evan only showed up when there was something in it for him. So I went back to care for Dad, not because anyone asked me to, not because anyone thanked me for it, but because despite all the emotional distance, he was my father. I spent 6 months bathing him, feeding him, listening to him apologize without ever really saying the words. We didn't have deep conversations. There weren't many heart-to-hearts. But he did smile when Paige read to him, and in those moments I saw a version of my father I'd always wished I'd known sooner. Gentle, human, vulnerable. Dad didn't die peacefully. Cancer rarely makes room for peace. But he looked at me one night with feverish eyes and trembling hands and whispered, "I'm sorry." It was the first time I'd heard him speak like that. To me, not at me. I held his hand and whispered back, "I know." Because I did know. And despite everything, I forgave him. The day he passed, the house felt empty in a way no silence could explain. Mom didn't cry. Evan didn't show up until the funeral. And I stayed strong for Paige. Because when you're someone's everything, falling apart isn't an option. Which brings us back to that lawyer's office. I truly believed that a lifetime of being the invisible child might finally be seen in the light of what I'd done. For Dad, for Paige, for our family. I thought the will would reflect all the nights I slept on a cot next to his hospital bed, all the meals I skipped so I could buy his medication, all the times I pretended I wasn't hurting so my daughter wouldn't see me break. But life doesn't reward sacrifice just because it's deserved, and family doesn't magically change just because someone dies. So when the lawyer cleared his throat and said, "Let's begin," I took a deep breath, held Paige's hand, and tried to believe that this time, finally, things would be different. I was wrong. But sometimes, being wrong is the first step to unraveling everything that kept you silent. The atmosphere in the lawyer's office could have been cut with a knife. I knew the stakes were high, but I didn't expect the blow to come so quickly, so sharply. As Mr. Hayes, the family lawyer, shuffled through the stack of papers in front of him, my heart was pounding against my ribcage, not from greed or entitlement, but from a desperate craving for acknowledgement, a sign that the past 6 months had meant something to someone other than me, someone besides Paige. "Let's begin with the reading of the will," Mr. Hayes said, his voice polite, steady, practiced. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and started. I, George Dawson, being of sound mind. The formalities dragged like dead weight, but I stayed still, clutching Paige's hand. Even Evan was paying attention now, leaning back with casual confidence, one ankle crossed over the other, thumb absently rolling over the face of his sleek Rolex. Mr. Hayes read the first big decision. The family house, our childhood home, the place my father lived and died, was left entirely to Evan. I felt the blood drain from my face. I had spent months living in that house, cooking in the kitchen I grew up in, waking up to the sound of Dad's labored breathing from the room down the hall. That house was filled with the weight of memories I never escaped, and yet, just like that, it was gone. Then came the business, a small but successful furniture company Dad had built from scratch. I thought maybe he'd split it. Maybe he'd recognize that I could use the income, that I needed the stability. No, it went to Evan, too. "He's always shown a natural interest in business," Dad had apparently written. The words stung like betrayal. Evan leaned in with a grin, barely hiding it now. "Dad always trusted me with the big stuff," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, eyes flicking toward mine. "He knew I'd take care of it the right way," Mr. Hayes continued. "Bank accounts, savings, assets, all to Evan. Then finally, to my daughter, Claire, I leave." I held my breath. My pocket watch. It was my father's before mine. I hope it reminds her of simpler times. The room fell silent. My ears buzzed like I was underwater. A pocket watch. That was it. Not a family heirloom with value. Not a piece of land. A watch. A broken one at that. Something he couldn't even bother to get fixed before handing it off. I stared at my lap, my knuckles white where they clasped Paige's fingers. Evan chuckled under his breath. "Wow, sentimental," he said with a smirk. "Guess Dad really knew who showed up in the end." His tone was dripping with arrogance. That's when my mother, sitting stone-faced beside him, turned and delivered the final blow. "He left things the way they were meant to be," she said without an ounce of hesitation. "You were always the disappointment, Claire. You shouldn't be surprised." I swallowed hard. Disappointment. The word echoed inside me like a lifetime of every rolled eye, every ignored question, every time I reached out and was met with silence. But it wasn't for me anymore. It was for Paige, my little girl, sitting right beside me, absorbing everything like a sponge. I looked at her and saw her lips part, her brows knit together, her small chest rising and falling in quiet confusion. I couldn't let her believe that treatment like this was ever deserved. I looked up, trembling but firm, and said, "I was there every day. I was there when Dad couldn't walk, when he couldn't eat, when he was dying." My voice cracked, but I didn't care. "You never came, Evan. Not once." Evan waved a hand dismissively, bare of any emotional weight. "I had a business to run, Claire. Someone had to do more than sit around and play nurse." His dismissiveness added fuel to the fire growing inside me. "That's enough," Mr. Hayes said, attempting mediation. But even he looked uncomfortable now. He saw the blatant imbalance. He knew what it meant. Suddenly, Paige shifted beside me, and I realized her little hands were shaking, but not from fear, from resolve. She stood up, her face flushed with a kind of bravery I didn't know she had. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a large, sealed manila envelope. "Grandpa gave me this," she said, voice steady but soft. "He told me not to open it unless Uncle Evan lied." The room froze. Evan's smirk melted. My mother's eyes widened for the first time that day. Even Mr. Hayes sat up straight. "What is this?" Evan scoffed, but it came out more nervous than annoyed. Paige looked at me, her eyes searching mine for permission. And in the middle of that emotional battlefield, with generations of pain and favoritism hanging in the air, I knew I had a choice. Stay silent like I always had, or finally stand up, for myself and for my daughter. I nodded. "Show us," I whispered. And that was the moment everything began to change. There are moments in life when time doesn't just seem to slow, it feels like it stops entirely. As Paige stood there, clutching the sealed manila envelope my father had entrusted to her, the room felt frozen in a bubble where every breath, every glance, every heartbeat carried meaning. The envelope itself didn't seem heavy, but it might as well have been holding the weight of everything we didn't know, or perhaps everything we'd always suspected. Paige glanced up at me with a face that was equal parts courage and uncertainty. She wasn't sure she was allowed to open it. She wasn't even sure what it meant, but she knew it mattered. And in that moment, I realized that the choice in front of us wasn't just about what the envelope held. It was about finally confronting the truth we'd been burying under silence for years. I reached out, placed my hand gently on her shoulder, and whispered, "You can open it." She nodded, then drew in a deep breath. In that way, only children do before stepping into something big, and carefully unsealed the envelope. The sound of the paper tearing through the stillness might as well have been a warning bell. Evan shifted uncomfortably. My mother stiffened, suddenly less sure of herself. And I, for the first time in a long time, wasn't afraid of the truth. Inside the envelope was a second, smaller envelope, labeled in my father's unmistakable handwriting, for Claire and Paige. Alongside it was a letter folded in thirds, its edges worn from being held, possibly by hands weakening from illness. Paige handed both to Mr. Hayes, who adjusted his glasses and looked more alive than he had the entire meeting. He recognized the legal weight of what this could mean. "This appears to be a supplementary document," he said, with a tone more careful than cautious. "It was not included with the original will. I'll read the letter aloud now." I held my breath. "To my daughter, Claire, and my granddaughter, Paige," he began. "If you are hearing this, then I am no longer here. I've left this letter in Paige's trust because I've trusted her innocence to carry it forward without bitterness, and because I know that, somewhere along the way, I led my family astray." The words were like a gentle earthquake, trembling the ground beneath our feet without breaking it. "Claire, I know I was never the father you needed me to be. I was proud of your brother's accomplishments, and I was blind to the value of your heart. You cared for me when I had nothing left to give. You carried burdens that weren't yours. And I said too little, too late. I am sorry." My hand flew to my mouth. I didn't want to cry. Not here, not in front of them. But hearing those words, spoken aloud after all this time, was like someone finally unlocking a door inside me I'd forgotten was even sealed. That's why I created a trust fund in your and Paige's names. 50% of my savings are in it. It was deposited after I signed the original will, and I chose not to include it there because I did not trust your mother or brother to honor my intentions. Gasps escaped from both me and Evan. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. I hoped they would do the right thing with what I left them, but I couldn't risk that hope on wishful thinking alone. Evan has been given enough. It is time that someone saw you, Claire, the way you've always seen others. Mr. Hayes paused, glanced at me, then continued. "I am not asking for forgiveness, but I hope you can find healing in this and, more importantly, some security for Paige's future. She deserves to grow in a world where love is not earned, but given. I failed to offer you that, but I hope to give her a chance." When the last word left the lawyer's mouth, silence swallowed the room once again, but this time it wasn't empty. It was full of shock, redemption, justice. Evan's face contorted into something between rage and disbelief. "This is insane," he snapped. "Dad would never—" But even he couldn't finish the sentence because deep down he knew the truth. He had lied about being there, about deserving everything, and now the truth had risen in the smallest, bravest hands in the room. My mother blinked, her face pale, her carefully structured world collapsing. She looked older, wrinkled, not from age, but from years of hardened beliefs cracking under the weight of empathy long denied. And then there was Paige, her tiny fingers curled around mine. "Mom," she whispered, "did I do the right thing?" I knelt down, took her face in my hands, and said, "You did more than the right thing. You did the brave thing." Because that day, my daughter wasn't just my child. She was the voice of what we'd all been waiting to hear, the truth we'd deserved long ago. And from that moment forward, I knew we weren't going to be silent anymore. The silence in the room after the letter was read was thick, charged with tension and disbelief, as if the air itself had shifted in density. It was the kind of silence that doesn't simply linger, it demands a response. Every eye was on someone else, searching for signs of what would happen next. It was Evan who moved first. He shot up from his chair so fast it rattled against the carpet. His face was no longer smug, no longer unbothered. It was flushed with fury and disbelief. "This is ridiculous," he spat, pacing like a trapped animal. "Dad was sick. He didn't know what he was doing. That letter, who knows when it was written?" His hands gestured wildly, searching for anything to invalidate the truth that had just shattered his carefully crafted world. Mr. Hayes remained composed. He interlocked his fingers on the desk in front of him. "Mr. Dawson, the letter was dated, signed, and notarized a week after the original will. There are legal codes included in the trust documentation. Everything appears valid." "Legal?" Evan scoffed, throwing his hands up. "So the guy who spent his last months barely able to speak had the clarity to write letters and sign documents?" His voice was sharp, cutting, his gaze landing on me as if I'd orchestrated it all. "This was you, wasn't it?" he accused. "Taking advantage of him while he was weak? Filling his head with lies?" "You didn't even visit him," I shot back, my voice louder, steadier than I felt. "Not once, in 6 months while he was dying." He turned toward me, seething. "I had a company to run. I wasn't sitting around playing nurse." Something inside me snapped. "I wasn't playing anything, Evan," I said, my voice firm, my fists clenched at my sides. "I was holding his hands when he was trembling. I was feeding him when he couldn't swallow. I was changing the sheets when he couldn't get out of bed. I was there when he looked at me with eyes full of regret. But you wouldn't know that because you never showed up." The room pulsed with the weight of the truth. Paige, still standing beside me, looked up at her uncle with a mixture of sadness and bewilderment. "Grandpa said lies never win," she said softly, but with power that seemed to come from something bigger than herself. Evan's gaze darted to her, and for the briefest moment I saw something like shame flicker in his eyes. But it disappeared as fast as it came. He turned to my mother next, silently pleading for her to speak up, to defend him like she always had. But Marianne stunned us all. She didn't say a word. Her face was pale, her lips tight, her eyes tired in a way I'd never seen. She looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time, not as a disappointment, but as a daughter. Her silence wasn't agreement. It was defeat. It was the sound of a lifetime of denial finally collapsing under what was undeniable. And in that moment, I didn't feel triumph. I felt release. Mr. Hayes cleared his throat. "The trust fund has already been established. 50% of Mr. Dawson's savings are already in Claire and Paige's names. The remaining assets remain assigned as per the original will." Evan slammed his palm on the table. "I'll contest it," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "You're welcome to try," Mr. Hayes replied calmly. "But based on the language of this document, your father took extra care to ensure this portion was protected from dispute." Evan stared at him, then at me, then at Paige, and suddenly the storm inside him seemed to settle, not into calm, but into something bitter and hollow. Without another word, he grabbed his jacket off the back of the chair and stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him with a violent echo. The sound of it felt final. After he left, the silence settled again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It wasn't suffocating. It was spacious, clearing, like the quiet that follows a devastating storm, a sign that something new can finally grow. Paige tugged gently on my sleeve. "Mom?" she asked, her voice small. "Are we okay now?" I knelt down beside her and wrapped her in my arms. "Yes," I whispered into her hair. "We're more than okay. We're free." I pulled back to look in her eyes, those kind, brave eyes. "You gave us that. You helped Grandpa's truth reach us." Her lips curled into a soft smile, and in that moment I realized that what my father did wasn't just about money or fairness. It was about legacy. Not the one that fills bank accounts, but the one that fills hearts. As we gathered our things to leave, I glanced at the broken pocket watch in my hand. It felt different now, not like a consolation prize, but like a reminder of time lost, time mended, and the time we still had to build something better. Paige slipped her hand into mine, and together, head high, heart steady, we walked out of that office and into a future neither of us would ever have to earn through anyone else's approval, a future we'd inherited, in truth, not in silence. The hum of the car engine was soft as we drove home from the lawyer's office. I remember glancing in the rearview mirror and catching Paige's reflection. Calm, thoughtful, her small fingers tracing the edge of the envelope that had changed everything. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't afraid anymore either. Something in her spirit had grown that day, like a young tree suddenly rooted in truth rather than uncertainty. And so had I. The days that followed weren't filled with dramatic confrontations or cathartic apologies. They weren't loud. They were quiet in the way healing often begins, subtle, lingering, like the steady return of breath after a long-held inhale. Evan didn't call. My mother didn't stop by. And for the first time in my life, the silence didn't feel like punishment. It felt like space to rebuild, to rewrite the chapters I'd once believed were already finished. The trust fund my father had set up wasn't a windfall of luxury. It was modest, but meaningful, enough to secure a stable home, enough to pay off lingering debts, enough to allow me to go back into teaching full-time, knowing I had a financial safety net instead of just emotional hope. But most importantly, it meant that I no longer had to stretch myself thin just to keep us afloat. I could make choices from a place of intention, not fear, and that realization was something money couldn't buy. I found a small townhouse on a quiet street just a few miles from the school where I taught. The first room I set up was Paige's, shelves of her drawings, a reading nook under the window, her stuffed animal collection smiling from a corner basket. I wanted her to feel grounded in something safe, something that felt like ours. It didn't take long before the difference in us began to show. Paige started talking more openly about her thoughts, her questions, her memories, even her fears, and I noticed how often she looked at me with admiration instead of worry. One evening, while we were painting together at the dining table, she asked a question I knew was coming. "Mom," she said softly, "did Grandpa really love you?" The paintbrush paused in my hand. I looked at her, those big, honest eyes, and I realized the truth wasn't simple, but it was still a truth worth saying. "I think he did," I said carefully. "He just didn't know how to show it, not in the way we needed him to. And sometimes, love is there even if it's quiet or late or confused." She nodded thoughtfully, accepting more than I had at her age. "I'm glad he gave you the letter," she said. "I'm glad he saw you." And I was too. That was the real inheritance, not the money, not the house, not the business, but the realization that I had always been worthy of love, worthy of being seen, and that no amount of denial, no bitter sibling rivalry, no cold mother's words could change that truth. A week after we moved in, a letter arrived in the mail. It was from my mother. The handwriting was rigid. The message was brief. "Claire, I don't know how to undo the past. I don't know what you want from me. But I do know this. I was wrong. You were never the disappointment. I was. If you're ever ready, I'm here. Mom." I stared at the page longer than I expected. I didn't feel vindicated. I didn't feel triumphant. Just sad, for the years lost to silence, and grateful, for the ones ahead that could be different if we chose them carefully. I didn't write back, not right away. Some wounds need time to scar before they can be touched without breaking open again, but I kept the letter, not as a reminder of the pain, but as proof that even the hardest hearts can learn something, even if it took the absence of my father for her to realize it. One evening, as I sat watching Paige play in the yard beneath the glow of a pink sunset, I thought about everything we'd endured, the will, the letter, the courtroom of family judgment we'd finally walked away from. And I understood something simple and profound. We inherit far more than money or possessions. We inherit stories, cycles, patterns. and we have the power to decide what we pass down and what ends with us. Before bedtime that night, Paige asked me if we were rich now. I smiled. "We're rich in the ways that matter," I said. "We have time, we have a home we love, and we have each other. That's more than enough." And as I turned off the light, I thought of the broken pocket watch tucked away in my nightstand. I hadn't fixed it yet. Part of me didn't want to. Because time, I knew then, wasn't something to rewind. It was something to walk through, one honest step at a time. We didn't just walk out of that lawyer's office with a legal victory. We walked out with clarity, and that was worth everything. Before you go, I just want to say thank you for listening to this story. Sometimes it's not the treasures we inherit, but the truths we uncover that shape who we become. If this story touched you, made you think, or even reminded you of someone in your own life, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Drop a comment below and let me know what part resonated with you the most. Was it Claire's strength, Paige's courage, or the hidden truth that changed everything? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful and emotional storytelling just like this. Your support helps this channel grow and keeps these stories alive. Until next time, take care of yourself, protect your peace, and remember, sometimes the quietest voices tell the loudest truths. Subscribe for more stories, like If You Felt Something. Comment your thoughts or a story of your own. Share to support the channel and spread the message. See you in the next one.